messieurs, si vous voulez bien nous rejoindre, on va attaquer la seconde table ronde de l'après-midi. Alors, le thème de la table ronde, c'est formuler en optimisant l'activité des ingrédients. Quelle technologie de protection? Point d'interrogation. Mais avant de débuter cette table ronde, je vais appeler Denis Poncelet à venir me rejoindre. C'est lui qui va avoir la charge de faire une présentation transversale en 20 minutes pour poser un peu le débat. Alors, Denis Poncelet, je rappelle que vous êtes professeur à l'ONIRIS et président du groupe de recherche sur la bioencapsulation. Alors, ONIRIS, peut-être que tout le monde ne connaît pas, et justement, c'est pas un acronyme.
You may not all know what ONIRIS is all about.
École nationale atlantique vétérinaire et des industries agroalimentaires.
Veterinary School of the Atlantic is also a school that is dedicated to food.
Donc vous avez 20 minutes pour votre présentation.
The food industry.
Donc, je vais vous introduire un peu
so you have 20 minutes. Thank you.
De tout ce qui est protection des
Well, I'd like to introduce the issue
Avant,
of protection of ingredients. I
Je suis
may
un petit peu un homme de
perhaps
Néandertal. Je vais au marché à peu
talk
près 2
about
fois par
plain
semaine.
things. You know, I'm a bit of a Neolithic person myself. I go to the market twice a week and I eat about 90% of fresh produce, which is usually not the case for most of our citizens in this country, where most foodstuff is of origin, of industrial origin, which has been stored, protected, dehydrated, rehydrated, which of course changes a lot our current feeding habits. The other comment I would make is that food is not necessarily available where there are most people, and there is an obvious imbalance, as we can see, just to mention the Asian countries, for example. In fact, whatever we say about the quality
La majorité des bonnes raisons n'empêcheront pas que
vegetarian
nous allons
food,
avoir une augmentation de la consommation
it
de
so
protéines.
happens that we will anyway be faced with an increase in the demand for proteins. So it seems that one simple idea for that is to produce more cereals to feed the cow and the pig, cows and pigs, which are the most polluting animals ever because of the lack of sustainability of the feeds, and they will have to be supplemented with more ingredients than these plain cereals. Now, if we take a look into the future again, we can see that we will certainly be using desiccated food. The ingredients processed food or rehydrated food, which of course change the way in which we are going to use food in the future. Very differently from today, we won't pick up a lettuce or a steak to eat it directly from the producer, or from the market stall. So maybe the best in between is to try and be as close as possible to Mother Nature. So this is quite contradictory in our societies because we're not very much in contact with nature. We're in cities where we lack green spaces and animals, and yet anytime you want to do something, you always refer to nature as being the model to follow. So what did nature choose to protect the cycle of the living? In fact, there is a highly complex biochemistry for that, but in addition, nature has provided most elements without with a membrane. There's no living systems without a membrane, whether a cell where you have an outer cell, an inner cell for the nucleus, and even more membranes that allows life. Without a membrane, you have no life. The best biochemistry you may have, it won't work if you have no membrane. So what is the role of membranes? Of course, they contain the elements. It also offers a structuration and it creates specific environment. All this in order to entrap the material, to isolate and protect it, and also to have a very accurate control between the cell and the outside world, but also within the cell, so that we have both a structuration and a functionalization. Can we really do ATP without membrane? Well, I'm afraid no, and if you have no ATP, there's no life.
Cellule artificielle, c'est quoi?
Having said this, what is an artificial cell? Well, this sounds synonymous to encapsulation.
On retrouve des formes d'encapsulation qui sont
There are different forms of
encapsulation.
In fact, we have very big capsules and capsules of several millimeters and capsules which are much smaller. And the word capsule is not really meaningful when we think of liposomes, for example, or protein arrangements, which are to scavenge a molecule. We move from a system which is a real microcapsule to a system which is a protective system for the nuclei. So there are many such capsules. I could have filled the whole page out of pictures of capsules, but can we produce the same types of capsules, and can this capsule reach the performances we expect them to have? Of course, we have several tools. I'm not going to run a course here on encapsulation. It might take a few hours, and I only have 20 minutes for that. So as you can tell, there are several tools to produce, whether wet, dry, big, small size elements, from the tiniest particles to several thousands of tons. We have a wide panel of tools, which doesn't mean that we will be able to reach maximum performances. But let me just take two examples to show that encapsulation can really offer unbelievable performances. In fact, encapsulation is already present on our market. In the previous presentations, I observed that either implicitly or not, most speakers have mentioned encapsulation. Quite obviously, Christophe encapsulates cell, but we heard about encapsulations with other speakers, and we personally have been working on the encapsulation of salt in order to reduce the quantity of salt, or at least to provide different characteristics to a foodstuff. This is also in order to avoid different interactions in the foodstuff. If we take the example of vitamin A, for example, which is an example for developing countries, it was at one time thought to introduce vitamin A in glutamate. Now, it so happens that vitamin A turns to yellow or brownish color when it is deteriorated, and if you don't want to degrade the aspect of glutamate, vitamin A had to be encapsulated to keep the glutamate as white as possible. Then you have amino acids, as you can see them in feeds for the cattle and for the livestock. There are all sorts of series of probiotics which are already existing as capsules. And to give you another idea, there are the Lipton tea with red fruit flavor. If you take a sniff, there's a delicious smell of red fruit. In fact, they're just aroma that are encapsulated. If you put the tea bag in boiling water, you get this smell because the smell is released with high temperature. And if you sniff at the box, you won't feel the same thing. So today, as you can see, there are lots of things that are being encapsulated. Now we can reach high performances, and this is the case of probiotics. We've had already some discussions about probiotics in this conference. I'm sure we will get back to that. Now, there are claims about probiotics, but once you have fruitful with your claims, you have to make sure you can really take advantage of them. If I take an example here in livestock feeds, you will express probiotics. You will have to store probiotics that will be then ingested, go through the rumen of the cow, and can you expect probiotics to be still alive after such a processing? That's insane. So the first step, which is extrusion, shows that if you find the right encapsulation, you can multiply the survival rate of probiotics in this extrusion phase. So obviously there are many possibilities just by the use of encapsulation. The other example I'd like to show is that we can possibly create new functions, pretty sophisticated, by the way, maybe not as much as a biological cell, but this is a system where we encapsulate glucose with enzymes. There's a layer that allows for an hygroscopic control. Under dry conditions, we have a protected enzyme. If water penetrates at a given velocity, substrates will be released to go through the enzyme and then to produce a molecule, which happens to be a bactericide in the case of listeria. Now, as this is an unstable molecule, you can get it on the market, but if you have it as an encapsulated product, you can keep it for several weeks. And altogether, this gives you a powder, which is pretty easy to handle, whereas the initial product is actually hygroscopic. So this is, of course, for developing countries. This is for farmers who've never been to school to use a very easy product. You just have to take a spoonful and put it into a mix to avoid listeria attacks. So I won't tell you much more. I'm just hopeful that you are interested in encapsulation, because I did a bit of advertising for that, and I would like to thank Vitagora for our event organized at the end of the month in Brussels. So if you're interested, please be welcome. And if you visit the association website, you'll also find a newsletter concerning probiotics and their different usages. So if you're interested, please feel free to come and visit our site. Thank you so much. Give our speaker a round of applause. So, Denis, if you don't mind, please come and sit here. And we now call the various speakers to this panel. Claire Gayani is maître de conférence with the University of Lorraine, with the Laboratory of Biomolecular Engineering. Then we have Hervé Huillier.
Hervé Huillier, donc vous êtes directeur
général de the general manager of Creates. You'll tell us more about your company. Then we have Tony, who is a research and development engineer for fermentation process with BioVidis. Benoît Laplaise is the marketing and sales manager for Le Safre Human Care. And then we have Thierry Van Damme. It's a pleasure to have you. You are a professor of pharmacy with the University of Strasbourg and vice president of the University of Strasbourg.
Alors, on va scinder un peu.
So, we're going to break up what we're doing in 3 stages. We're going to focus on the market first with Claire Gayani. If you'd like to take a microphone, please, Claire. Among foodstuffs, functional foodstuffs, we can talk about probiotics. Do you have any figures to characterize that market? Please hold the microphone close. Yes, if you look at these functional foodstuffs, there's a big family, in fact. There's a family containing probiotic bacteria or microorganisms. That family plays an important role. We can give figures between 1 to 25% in terms of countries, so it varies according to the country. So that family is fairly important, and it's started to be developed in the 2000s. So there's a big focus on probiotics as of the start of the 2000s, and that movement is supported by the focus on nutrition and health in the science field. So some figures. The overall market, the global market for probiotics in the 2000s represented 6 billion euros. In 2010, the global market had doubled, moving from 6 to over 14 billion euros in turnover. As of 2010, the evolution is more difficult to identify because of the European regulations. We already talked about European regulations this morning. and the market of functional foodstuffs containing probiotic material. So it's difficult to predict future changes. We think that in Europe this evolution will be positive, but not as big as in the past, because industrialists are going to be a bit hesitant in terms of developing products. Benoît Laplaise, probiotics, it's not just about medication, right? Yes, as you know, probiotics are microorganisms, living microorganisms ingested by another organism. The bacteria are very well known, of course. Yeasts, microscopic fungus that we ingest. When you ingest ultra yeast, for example, that is a probiotic. Claire, do we have an idea today? Do we know whether microencapsulation is marginal? Do you have some figures for us? Well, as Denis said earlier on, microencapsulation is something that we can find in different foodstuffs. So if we focus on probiotics, you might see it as marginal. There are applications in chocolate, in certain ice creams, especially in North America and in Japan. If we focus on the lead market for probiotics, which is the market for dairy puddings or yogurts, we realize that most of the products out there on the market, what can we cite? Let's give an example. Actimel yogurts, for example. Well, these products contain probiotic bacteria that haven't necessarily been encapsulated. So recent studies have underlined, and this was underlined by Denis, that these probiotic ingredients, if they are to act, they have to get into the intestine, and they have to fight. They have to fight during the production process for the foodstuff. The bacteria have to resist shearing forces. They have to resist extremely high temperatures. The other barrier that they have to get across concerns conservation. Once the foodstuff has been manufactured, it's not going to be eaten straight away. So there you have problems in terms of oxygen, in terms of the acidity of certain environments, a fruit juice environment, for example. And to finish, the last barrier is the gastric barrier. And that's where they come up against enzymes, fairly acid pH environments. So they have to get through all of these barriers. And so the bacteria may not be very present in the intestines. So the answer, the solution to this is maybe encapsulation, if the consumer agrees to pay the price of that encapsulation. Yes, quite. Denis Poncelet, would you like to add to that? Yes, I think that probiotics are making us dream about the future. Some refer to it as formulation, I refer to it as encapsulation, but when we have a product that's fairly sensitive or which is of a shape that is not suitable, you encapsulate it, for example, a powder in a cake. The only way to get it into certain environments, this powder, is to encapsulate it. So the market is not huge, but if we agree to extend it to structuring and the creation of functions, we're talking about markets weighing in at hundreds of tons for human nutrition. For animal nutrition, animal feeding, I've had discussions with industrialists. The idea is to produce millions of tons, so it's not just a marginal market.
Thierry Van Damme,
you're a professor of pharmacy at the University of Strasbourg. Yes, pharmacy. Is that right? Yes, yes, galenic pharmacy, the forms of medications, the association of active ingredients. So, what is the link between what you do and this field? Well, the fields are similar because in terms of formulation, regularly I have people ringing me up, colleagues ringing me up, asking me about pharmaceutical issues, and they're from this field. And, you know, they look at mixing, encapsulation, grain size distribution techniques. So the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry have similarities. The chemistry is the same. So this is a known field for you. However, we haven't talked about authorizations, marketing authorizations yet. Notices of compliance. Yes, we're talking about pharmacy for the moment, and that's not the same thing. It's not about putting active ingredients that are consumed by patients. You have a whole series of studies that have to be carried out to guarantee the quality and safety and efficacy of medications in the pharmaceutical industry. And that's not the same thing in the food industry. So we don't have to file for a notice of compliance, for example. But from a technological point of view, there are very many similarities between the two sectors. Denis Poncelet, you talked about microencapsulation, but can we do that at a compatible price in terms of what the consumer is ready to pay? So I'm going to slightly contradict Thierry, because unlike what one might believe, it's more difficult to do encapsulation of a foodstuff than of a medication. If tomorrow I say, okay, you've got cancer and here's medication, here's a drug that's going to save you, but it'll give you a heart attack in 20 years. If I tell you that this is the best yogurt that's going to stop you from having a heart attack in 20 years, well, the effect is not the same. In fact, the field of microencapsulation for food is a very limited field. It's considered as a barrier. In the field of the pharmaceutical industry, you have to demonstrate that any negative effects caused by encapsulation are not going to have a big effect on human health. So, from a regulatory point of view, the pharmaceutical industry is much more strict than the food industry. And it's very complicated from an industrial point of view. Do you agree with that? Thierry, yes, I agree with that, especially given that in the pharmaceutical field, we have an awful lot of information, like pharmacopoeia. There are monographs that are well established. I'm not saying that things are more vague, but it's more difficult. But I agree with what Denis has said. So this happens frequently, and this comes back to what you were saying. Because there is very little material available and perhaps less technologies, less techniques. So there are some conventional techniques used in the pharmaceutical industry for the use of solvents, for example. How do you remove the last ppms of some kind of chloride from an encapsulation process? So we have less technologies, fewer products, and perhaps more constraints, more requirements. I think it's simpler to encapsulate a drug, an antibiotic, but if you take the case of a probiotic. So the challenge is big, and alongside that, food industrialists don't have much money. So on the one hand, you've got these requirements, when you look at them, which are much stronger than in the pharmaceutical industry, and you've also got to do things that are very low cost in the food industry. And the tonnage is quite different. I've had requests mainly from the animal food industry, amounting to millions of tons. I don't know if you can talk about millions of tons for drugs. So when you talk about hundreds of millions or thousands of millions of tons, the cost is very important. You have to have optimization in terms of engineering, and that's a difficult task. So the work involved is difficult, and we don't have enough engineers specializing in encapsulation. However, we do have quite a few products that are already out there on the market and that are encapsulated. So it's not something that's impossible, but it's perhaps not as obvious as what many people may think. So the equation is a delicate one, it's a complex one, but is it changing? What about the parameters of this equation? Is it becoming less and less costly? is it becoming more compatible with the food, with the money available? Yes, there are even techniques that seem to be very marginal a few years ago. For example, there's one technique where you co-extrude two liquids in order to obtain droplets, and that gives you a formula with a core and an external layer. And a few years ago, when I was giving lessons on encapsulation, I said, don't forget about that because there will be no future to it. But I have to admit that today in labs, that technology is being developed because the tools have meant that this dripping technique, well, we could make a few kilos a few years ago. Today, we can produce 100 tons a year in our laboratory. And it takes up a little space in the laboratory. So technologies evolve, and because they evolve, costs can be lowered. So there's another important notion. Things change in relation to time. Industrials adapt to what we can offer them. Industrialists agree to pay an overcost as long as they have some kind of return on the investment later on. So the industrialists may lose 30% during the encapsulation and storage phase if they can have a return on the investment later. In 10 years' time, I suppose that an industrialist may have a different attitude. There are conventional technologies that are currently being eliminated to the benefit of new technologies that provide better structures. And this is the message I try to get across. The day somebody can produce an artificial biological cell that works, that will be a great day. Because don't forget, you take a shower every day, so that means 30,000 showers over the course of your life, and you're still here. I don't know a capsule that would be able to be washed 100 times. So this is what we're trying to strive towards, to have this kind of human capsule. So, you know, we just need time. We're researchers. Obviously, we can't do it for tomorrow. Benoît Laplaise, keeping an organism alive for 2 years, that's what you've been doing for decades now. You know how to do that. Yes, I wanted to come back to something. We're talking about technologies and techniques. These work because consumers go to buy boxes of whatever in the supermarket. It's a bit like your iPhone that you use with 2 fingers, but you don't know exactly what's inside your iPhone. You don't know anything about the communication technology, but you buy it because it's easy to use. So everything that we're talking about here that's complicated, that has to become simple. What is simplicity? Well, it means that you put it in your fridge and maybe you forget about it. You put it in your medicine chest, and you forget about it. And nothing happens to it. It remains stable. And stability is a key word. It's a technical word. It means basically simplicity for the consumer. If it's not simple, the consumer's not going to buy it. Let me tell you a story. The other day I was in Los Angeles at a big lab. There were PhD students all over the place. We were talking about metabolism, we were talking about probiotics, and there was a guy who said, that's all very well, Mr. Laplace, but you see, your thing, I can put it in a box, I can put the box on a pallet, the pallet will go into a truck, it'll go around the world, and there'll be nothing left at the end of the day. So it's important that the supply chain is solid. So in probiotics, you've got the science of the little beastie there that produces a miracle, but that little beastie, that little animal has to be alive in 2 or 3 years' time. Now at Le Safre, we're lucky because we also sell yeast. And we sell baker's yeast. Now, if you make bread, it's better for that yeast to be alive, otherwise you can't make your bread. And when you go to the bakers, if you go to Algeria or Pakistan, they don't really have a cold change. A container may reach 60 degrees, a container full of yeast. When you go to Indonesia and you go into a pharmacy, it's 35 degrees with 75% humidity in the pharmacy. So, our ability to sell yeast, well, we realize that if the yeast is properly contained, it remains stable. And that's because of the membrane. There's a very strong membrane. It's called a wall, and it's fairly stable around the yeast. Now, of course, we're very careful about the way we dry this. It's very important when we have a microorganism. It's very important to keep it alive, but dry it at the same time. So we've got several drying methods. You've got, how to put it in packaging with several layers. Anti-something layer, anti-other layer. And this is a key technology controlled by Le Safre, so that we can maintain our yeast alive, so that the yeast is stable throughout the supply chain. So you talked about packaging. Is it really that important? Well, imagine a chain going from one wall to another. Imagine that there is a plastic link in the chain. Well, the problem of stability, when we talk about the trip from the factory to the end user, well, you don't want to have that very weak link, and it's very complicated for a specialist technician. That specialist is going to focus on his or her job. Producers produce, packagers make packaging. My job is to look at this overall marketing vision. So I have to say, okay, I don't want any weak links. And packaging, if you look at packaging, well, it's not the main objective of an engineer's life in a factory. An engineer wants to design, wants to do R&D, but we often realize that, it's important to have the packaging. We've got something that's solid, that can go across oceans, so packaging is really fundamental. And we have complete packaging services. We've done some great studies on packaging. So packaging is all about, okay, you've got your factory, you make your yeast, and you put it in a complex package. But there, where is the weak link? It's the guy, it's the customer. The customer opens it, forgets to close it, etc. And he puts his probiotic capsule yeast in a capsule that doesn't close properly. So there's another packaging, and that's the consumer's packaging, and there's a transfer of knowledge with those people. They need to use the raw material properly. It's a raw material that's been properly packaged, but when the consumer changes the packaging, it has to be done properly. So it's up to us to make sure that we work on packaging in the proper way, using blister packs, etc., to compensate for what happens to the contents of the packaging when the product gets to the consumers. So when a consumer buys an iPhone, the iPhone looks at the packaging first and foremost, don't forget. Yes, indeed. Denis Poncelet, do you share that opinion? Well, I would say that packaging is a kind of encapsulation. So the same problem. It's true that one of the things that I notice in almost 90% of cases where you have encapsulation in a laboratory, they sell dry products. We can't transport wet products. It's difficult to do that. Drying is perhaps the most crucial stage of encapsulation. That stage is important so that you can maintain survival during drying. It's important because you have to maintain life during storage, and you have to maintain life when you rehydrate the product. So one of the problems that we encounter when we talk with people, whether we're talking about packaging or encapsulation, is that there are people who are specialized. They're proud to have made a very pretty capsule, and they forget that that's going to have to be sold on the other side of the world, and it has to be stable. I had a chat with an industrialist a week ago. They made capsules at laboratory level. Things were properly dried. They had things in test tubes with a thickness of 5 centimeters. But what about when that thing is transported to Pakistan? You're going to put them in pallets 1 meter high. The capsules on the bottom, will they have the mechanical strength to bear the weight of all of the other capsules on the pallet? So I agree with you entirely. Unfortunately, in our laboratories, we don't have that approach. We don't look enough at the entire chain, the entire supply chain, and that is a big problem. You were asking how long it would take. Well, if we really want to have really high performance levels, one day industrials and academics will have to talk more so that they can think about the problem in a very comprehensive manner, instead of doing it on a step-by-step basis. As long as we're doing things on a step-by-step basis, we only have part answers. Okay, you can have great encapsulation in the laboratory, you can have great industrial production methods, etc. You can even do great packaging. But as each person is working in their own corner, you don't have the right kind of cohesive system. So this is the case of selenium, no? Yes, let me go back to what Denis Poncelet was saying. He's saying that the membrane is everything. And this is well known. A microorganism, or an organism, it can channel an active ingredient. Let me talk about selenium. Selenium is incredible. The selenium atom and sulfur atom are very similar. And a yeast, when you get it to grow on a substrate where you add a lot of selenium, it's going to pick it up and metabolize it as if it was a sulfur atom. Where does it put it? Well, it puts it in the amino acids, the sulfur amino acids that become seleniated amino acids. So that produces a kind of a bag, yeast, proteins, and in the proteins, in the amino acids, you've got selenium with covalent bonds. So you can imagine the level of protection, the level of storage. It's super safe. You know that you're not going to be poisoned with it. But the half-life, whether we're talking about a human being or an animal, the time it takes to digest, to assimilate it is great. So we're not talking just about proactives, we're talking about an active ingredient that we put inside something that is intermediate. Yeast is a plant, if you like. So this is, so we've managed to channel and stabilize and simplify the contribution of selenium to a whole population. So it's all about looking at what nature can offer us. Yes, it's all about making a capsule that's biological. So it's all about making the ideal capsule. And perhaps engineering will be developed in that area. Hervé Huillier, you are the general manager of Creates. You build technical solutions at industrialists' requests. Are you seeing a demand for microencapsulation? Well, in fact, I'd like to link up with what's been said here. We are involved in microencapsulation, we have technologies. Our job is not to do research. We design technical solutions based on microencapsulation, and we look at the whole chain. In fact, the demand coming from our customers is not just to say, okay, I want to encapsulate the product. It's also about how can I do that for the entire supply chain, from the factory to the consumer and into the gut of the user, basically. Yes, and whoever that consumer may be, whether it's a human being or an animal. So there's a change of paradigm, a shift in paradigm in terms of research and development, and that's linked to a certain number of things, especially the life cycle of products. The life cycle has got shorter. Consumers are changing their consumer habits. So sometimes that means that we are facing paradoxes. We have to change the way we see things. So the change in microencapsulation and R&D is, how do you address the problem? How do you look at things globally, not just the technical part of microencapsulation, which is already a state-of-the-art technology. So that's the demand, the global demand. But are there any limits? Are you coming up against any technological limits, for example? Well, we talked about limits earlier on. There's the question of the cost. That really is a limiting factor in terms of development. We've also we've got another limit that we can get across, and that is the regulatory limit. There are regulatory pressures on raw materials, processes, and products. These pressures have been very strong over the past few years, and like other sectors of activity, this has been beneficial for microencapsulation. We're seeing new raw materials arriving that meet regulatory requirements that can be used in the technology, and today, Denis said this, we're seeing older technologies coming back onto the stage because they've improved from a technological or productive point of view, but also from the point of view of regulations. Tony Poubli, over to you. You're an R&D engineer. You focus on fermentation processes. Concretely today, there are different things being developed. Is it the same for fermentation with bacteria in anaerobic conditions? Yes, to come back to everything that's been said, we realize that the problems are dependent on the strains. This is the case of yeast. We know how to find the right solutions. But we base not our research not on yeast, but on bacteria in the gut, in the digestive tube. So we're talking about, we're focusing on problems like how to get through the digestive tube in a safe manner, with the right kind of reliability, the right kind of efficacy. Now, what I can say here, like as Mr. Poncelet was saying, working as part of a consortium between Merck, Clinia, Bio-Vitist, and a fourth partner, this means that we can pool all of our skills. This gives us a more global vision of the issue. That helps us with production, which is our objective after all. So effectively, everything that is fashionable in terms of anaerobic conditions. Can you explain what are strict anaerobia? These are bacterial strains that cannot support oxygen more than 2 minutes. So when they are exposed for longer than 2 minutes, they lose their level of reliability. In terms of equipment and process, this means specific requirements. We have to adapt to these, and it's, as Mr. Lacroix was saying this morning, we are facing requirements that are completely new. We worked in microaerophile bacteria in the past that have a certain amount of tolerance. These bacteria, these anaerobic bacteria, are more difficult. And this raises another question. How are we going to make sure that these bacteria can be kept with a minimum amount of viability? And how can we make sure that we can transfer them to the target zone, the colon, for example, and be sure that they will be efficacious? So the requirements are really quite considerable. So, of course, the best thing is to have production, fermentation, centrifugal forces, dry freezing. And, of course, with strict anaerobic bacteria, it's difficult to do that. But we're working on these issues, and we hope that we will get some good results in this area. Can you do it today?
Well, we've got some results. That's for the consortium. Of course, it's pretty positive, particularly with freeze drying, and in terms of reliability, it's not 100% positive results, but we know, for example, that we have a bacteria which is effective with a 1% variability. So this is a loss that can be tolerated. Is this something you are working on, Denis Poncelet?
Personne n'avait entendu.
Oui,
c'était préventif.
Oui, alors
I believe that
encapsulation
under the drastic conditions of anaerobia is pretty complex. well, we rather air the reactors. I must say I also did my PhD on fermentation in anaerobic conditions. It's pretty difficult to manage. So we would rather privilege freeze-drying or drying, but once the capsules are within the capsule, you can indeed have a protection to oxygen or against oxygen. In fact, one of the mistakes, the common mistake, is to believe that hydrophilic media are, in fact, very positive for oxygen. So this is something to consider. Should you freeze dry or not? So it seems that you're, in fact, opening a kind of way. We're on the. This is these are the early steps of a new way. Absolutely, and I'm not surprised that they have such a success because these cells are not very difficult to manage. I'm not saying that it is a simple question, of course. It's not a simple problem, but as soon as you move to bacteria that are more fragile, aerobic bacteria that are more fragile, things are different. I did a bit of encapsulation with bifidobacteria. They still can compensate with a bit of oxygen, but you know, that means it takes a long time. We won't settle the issue in just a few months. It's a complex issue. Absolutely. There's nothing in the books about these types of bacteria and how to deal with them, but it's something that can probably be managed. We're on the right track, I think. Now, the alternatives proposed by encapsulation is perhaps an issue that can be further discussed in a later stage, but it can also be a good track to follow for the industry. You're also working on solid fermentation. Is this a changing area? Well, historically speaking, in the BioVitis group, I have to say that BioVitis is part of the Green Tech group, which is based in Clermont-Ferrand. They work on cosmetic applications. NC work on algae, and BioVitis work mainly on bacteria. Now, as to solid fermentation, from the historical point of view, the BioVitis group had until recently worked on renin, which was costly with a lot of manpower and long culture times. So as there was a need for a faster yield, we moved to solid fermentation. We're still in a prospection phase, however. However, for the applications, when it comes to applications, we have different sorts. We have agronomics, environment, agribusiness, or pharmaceuticals, sorry. I can see an interest for the environment and for agronomy for one good reason. In fact, if we were to work on the agribusiness in pharmaceutical compounds, we would find it difficult to remain sterile. So we work with some experts. We were able to see Monsieur Durand, one expert. We also have Leven in the north of France, they're experts as well on solid fermentation. But we as industrialists remain within the field of agronomic applications. In fact, keeping the substrate, the growing substrate, creates a kind of protection whenever needed when it comes to biofertilizers, etc. So this is what we do. We work with solid fermentation, but this is the area we are dealing with. What do you mean by biofertilizers? For crops? Yes, well, quite obviously, you may know that we have filed a petition, a temporary petition, to be licensed for fertilizer. I must say I'm not the person in charge of this project, but this is just to show that our little region is pretty dynamic. And our small companies are also pretty dynamic. To get back to solid fermentation, I had a discussion with Monsieur Poncelet just before, and when it comes to probiotics, the idea is to have a kind of cocktail of probiotics. Well, in the same way, with solid fermentation, it is interesting for enzymes to produce enzyme cocktails or mix. And this is why it is interesting to have groups like Le Safre, who produce xylanase, etc. They work with pure products. And again, in the field of environment, it would be interesting to create an enzyme cocktail that could be of interest to our clients and distributors.
Non. Ouais. Alors, dernier point, là où il y a encore du progrès, où il y a aussi du progrès,
one last point. There have been major advances for stress. Yes, when it is about fermentation, stress for fermentation is a known aspect. Yes, but things are improving. Well, we can work at different phases. We can work at the fermenter stage, or right after centrifugation. And then we have cryoprotectors. These are known techniques, but for some time, for a short period of time, we've seen industrialists with yeast extract and peptone producing, in fact, two-in-one, if I may say, two-in-one products. But they're also interesting because of the possibilities for freeze drying. So these are all-in-one ingredients that we are currently testing to see if we can get good results with them. Now, to get back to stress, the stress for fermenters are known, such as decreasing the temperature, creating an either basal or acidic stress, or introducing ethanol, etc. So these are interesting sources of stress. They're all strain dependent, but show an interest in the post-treatment. And do you combine with cryoprotection? Absolutely, after centrifugation, yes. In the past, we would have tested sugars, whether dextrose, saccharose, etc. Now, we rather mix sugars plus anti-caking, buffers, etc. We try to optimize to get a better yield. Well, in the field of animal feeds, they seem to be ahead of us. What do they do? Well, in animal feeds, we are halfway between foodstuff and medicines, because we work with premix. That is, that the feeds are being supplemented with various aspects. I'm speaking here, of course, of yield animal, not cats and dogs. So
Mais dans le domaine, je veux dire, de l'animal de rente, on est vraiment, je veux dire, à cheval.
For these animals, we are really halfway between the foodstuff and the medicine. In concrete terms, what do you mean? Well, there are French companies located in the south of France. I'm not going to advertise for them, but there are products which are available on the market, which are premixed as well. Now the question is that of the dose level. Is this just a food supplement or is this a drug? That's the question. It will all depend on the dose being used.
Alors, Hervé Huillier, pardon. Dans l'évolution, quand on regarde un peu vers le futur, on se rend compte qu'aujourd'hui, on combine les technologies, mais on combine aussi les
Hervé Huillier, we can tell from the evolution that we combine sectors and technologies. We speak of cosmeceutics, etc. What is this all about? Yes, absolutely, you're right. We can combine pharmaceuticals and foodstuff, but in the field of microencapsulation, sorry, in the field of foodstuff, we have understood that microencapsulation is interesting. Not only for what is inside the body, but also outside. And today, the cosmetic products, which deal with the outer shell of the body, also uses techniques that are used in foods in the agri-feed business. So the cosmeceutics market is currently developing, in particular in Asia and in the USA, and combines the know-how of encapsulation derived from the agri-food business, from the pharmaceutical business, and they deal not only with the not with the inside of the body, but as I said, with the outer shell. What about the perspectives of encapsulation? Are they interesting? Well, yes and no. They are interesting from the technical or technological point of view. If you look back into the slide that Denis Poncet presented, we are on the left of the curve of the line with products which are maybe 1,000 times smaller than those of microencapsulation and physical properties which are very different. They can have an interest. I'm thinking of the use of stains or poorly soluble products for which there's no need for emulsifiers. But the problem is that of the cost. Where can you go up to which point can you go? Because you have to think of the cost. And what about technologies? Are there doors open for the future? Well, in the field of medical drugs, there is a very interesting benefit now for foodstuff. That should be something really important to justify this technology for products on the market.
Denis Poncelet,
what do you see for the future? Any interesting possibility? Well, nano-encapsulation is a big debate, but if you think it over, this has been done for ages. There are all sorts of elements with nanocapsules, and yet there are wide discussions because we don't know so much about the toxicity of these products. So this leads us to an absurd situation. If you look into European programs, there are lots and lots of projects concerning nanotechnologies. And altogether, if you want to file a patent, you have to demonstrate that there is no risk, and yet no one knows how to demonstrate that. No one is able to demonstrate the absence of risk. So I am not sure we will really invent new encapsulation technologies, but rather that we will refine, improve the technologies. In some cases, we even use technologies that were already used a few years back and which we left aside. We also have the system which consists in having a precipitate of polymers with glutaraldehyde and gelatin for cross-linking purposes. Now, if you know the European regulation, people will tell you, full stop, this is impossible. And yet, this technology, in fact, was used by a certain number of small companies in France, which have now totally disappeared, have closed down. And yet, these techniques are back again with pea protein, because they're cross-linked with enzymes, for example. So I believe we will get back to a different evolution of the technique. We will have developing techniques rather than extraordinary outbreaks. Some have tried to use a solvent extraction, to use different solvents, and so on and so forth. That's fine. We will certainly also have a greener evolution. We work in the field of interface polymerization that used to be done with solvents that were toxic. Now we use vegetable oil, for example, for the same process. So we are more environmental friendly. And then there's another dimension to this. Having something that is simple to use is also important. We need our encapsulation techniques to make products easy to use. No one wants to buy microcapsules, or no one is worried about the stability of a product as such, until the day when there is a real interest when it comes to the usage of the product. So there's still a lot of work to do to convince intermediaries. Because actually the end customer, for most of them at least, isn't bothered about protection issues, about micro-encapsulation, but the work is to be done between those working in the field of protection and those who eventually will take advantage of the technology. And this means having better communication so as to better understand these technologies. Are you working on these lines, Monsieur Villiers? Well, yes, and I do agree with Denis here. We have several tracks for the future. The first point is about the communication we have to make around encapsulation techniques. A lot of industrialists have tried to communicate on encapsulation, and it's a failure. So we are not so much communicating on the technical aspect. That's one thing. For example, in cosmetics or cosmeto-textile, the DIM company was the first to launch an hydrating tights, but they stopped producing them because it was too technical for the customer. But now they're back on the market with something different maybe, but they have to give up. The idea is that we are no longer in an era of discovery of such molecules. There are all sorts of nanotechnologies, but we are into an approach which consists in opening one's fridge and say, now, what can I do with everything that is in my fridge? We have guests tonight, what can we do? That's the idea. Rather than say, oh, look, I have to go and buy this, and that for my recipe. So we're in a different era. Micro-encapsulation, in fact, affects a lot of domains. So we need science, we need logistics and regulation. All sorts of industrial sectors are involved. But now what comes next is to know what to do with the existing technologies so as to combine them, handle them, manipulate them, reshuffle them to do something out of them. And that's a new approach, and this will trigger new applications for microencapsulation. And obviously the former technologies that were somewhere in the bottom drawer are now back to the top of the desk in the field of microencapsulation. We can see them back on the market now. Okay then, now that was it for the future. will now give the microphone to the audience. So a few questions and answers. Who would like to open the file? Would you like to make a comment or ask a question or get back to one specific point of our discussion? No one?
Juste pour lancer le débat. Merci, monsieur. Vous voulez bien vous présenter.
Olivier Ducigny, CEPIC. Juste une précision
Olivier de Lucigny from CEPIC. Just a question about encapsulation for pharmaceuticals. I agree with Monsieur Van Damme. We have a lot of pharmaceutical conferences speaking about encapsulation with DDS and other projects, but the problem is in the pharmaceutical industry is that they no longer invent molecules. They try to use the existing knowledge, so they try to revamp all these, dress Maran's lamp, so to speak. And they try to deliver active ingredients in a different manner into the human body. So everything that has to do with encapsulation has a major future ahead in the pharmaceutical industry. I can confirm this. And again, in the field of pharmaceuticals, I guess you'll agree, if you have an active ingredient for which the toxicity data are known, the best way to extend this active ingredient is to give it a new galenics and therefore to encapsulate it. You can start from maybe a new design. New molecules have a lifespan of 7 to 10 years before being developed, and it is very costly. It's between 1 to 3 billion euros. So working on these new types of galenics can be, of course, a solution to them. A comment about nano-encapsulation. Nano-encapsulation is a natural principle for foodstuff. If you just think about milk, the typical nanoparticles are the casein mycelium cells, the vitamins and others. Now, when nanoencapsulation is artificial and has not been spontaneous, obviously it can be extremely dangerous. And I support the idea that we should think of safety first. Let's take an example, that of iron. Iron is a micronutrient which is highly regulated in the human body. If you shunt the absorption principles of iron, you deregulate, you totally destroy the safety mechanisms for iron absorption, in particular the fact that iron shouldn't be left free. So I shall be extremely cautious about nano-encapsulation because we do not obviously know all about it. And we obviously do not know about the risks. Are you speaking of encapsulation in general or nano-encapsulation? No. Nano-encapsulation, because encapsulation is not to be targeted into the gut. This is what is to be filtered through the gut wall. In fact, nano-encapsulation should be seen different from micro-encapsulation. To me, it's like a vector. It's a way of creating a specific activity, a particular activity, in order to hit a particular area or site. And as Christophe said, we should not really wonder about the safety of the process, but rather know whether it offers something of interest. If we cannot demonstrate the interest of nano-encapsulation, I see no point. In fact, this is very fashionable, very trendy, isn't it? They like to have small capsules. This is what industrialists ask from me. But what can you do with the 100 nanometers capsules? What can you place in it? What kind of wall thickness do you obtain with such a capsule? How can you imagine that nothing is going to penetrate or go through a membrane which is just a few nanometers? So I'd rather advise them to use bigger capsules. Make it as big as possible. Now, the problem is that no one knows about the maximum size. The typical case in yogurt, a capsule shouldn't be bigger than 50 microns. 50 microns. Now, who's demonstrated that? No one, and yet everybody thinks it is the truth, and yet no one knows. So quite obviously, if you have a soft capsule in a yogurt with fruit, for example, 50 microns or even 500 microns is not something you can feel. Now, if you have sand in at 50 microns in a yogurt, that's just, you'll feel it, of course. So the bigger your capsules and the thicker the membrane, the better the performance is, without trying to go for more sophisticated techniques. So I'm not against nano-encapsulation for cancer treatment in particular. I know some works have been undertaken and the results are fantastic. They may save our lives tomorrow, so we can't be against that. But we know they're looking for something in particular, and nano-encapsulation will add something. And this is something that couldn't have been achieved without nano-encapsulation. If you want to do it without it, just forget it.
Monsieur, question.
Pascal Molimar, Merck. En fait, on a beaucoup parlé au cours de ce débat.
Pascal Molimar from Merck, the Merck company. We spoke a lot about quality, preservation of products, but I'd like to insist on innovation. And the field opened by technology Tony spoke of the new generation of microorganisms, which are strictly anaerobics and therefore very sensitive to oxygen. If we have access to a new generation of probiotics, which we're not aware of actually today because we can't even grow them or identify them, could we possibly believe that thanks to encapsulation technologies we could have something different than freeze-dried tablets or capsules and have, for example, probiotics in a syrup, in a spray, in a fluid drink, whatever, in a fluid wet formulation, knowing that usually a probiotic is not going to survive under such conditions. And besides, if I wish to deliver in Indonesia and if I wanted to be still alive 2 years after on my chemist's shelf, do you think I can really think of encapsulation to get such a product? Well, it all depends on what you call innovation. What you have been describing here is rather an improvement of existing technologies. You can improve technologies by a factor of 20, and obviously the techniques today that will allow you to send probiotics at the other end of the planet will be multiplied by 2, 3, 4, and in 2 years from now maybe someone will again find a trick to multiply this factor to 20. We just have to agree on what you call innovation. Of course there are innovations, some are more striking than others. Let me give you an example. Totally outside the food business. The food business, yes, we have a lot of work on phase change for encapsulated material. You can replace a 30mm wall by a 15mm wall if you use phase change products. So that's very far from anaerobics, isn't it? I have restarted works on the aeration of reactors, so that's totally contrary to anaerobic situation. Oxygen, well, the air in fact is a poor carrier for oxygen, conversely to what we might think. And in the case of silicon capsules, you can increase the possibilities by a factor of 20, 30, 50 when it comes to transferring oxygen. Encapsulation might introduce an outstanding innovation, but for many cases, of course, we will certainly take patents, but we will just improve existing concepts. One of these days, we will perhaps discover that such a powder has a better survival, and someone is going to file a patent for that. So I think it's something that we have to think about. Please, could you give us some explanation about what you mean by phase change? If you increase the heat of water by 1 degree, you increase by 1 kilocalorie per kilo, or 4.18 joules per degree. Now, if you have water passing from the liquid state to steam, you produce 2,000 kilojoules. That is that if your material changes the phase at a given temperature, the energy consumption is by far much higher than just increasing this water by 10 degrees. So you could possibly maintain a room at temperature, at a given temperature, just because there is a material that has a change in the phase. To give you an example, the company Decathlon, the sporting company, is producing textile gear that absorbs your heat. So you sweat less, and when you stop jogging, for example, or running, your heat is being transferred back to you. So there are lots and lots of innovation. We are only a small company, but we have maybe something like 2 applications per week. Unfortunately, people are always in a hurry, so we cannot satisfy all such requests. And in all cases, I can tell you that these requests are different and varied. There is a real demand for these technologies. Of course, I am familiar with the field of encapsulation, but there are other areas where the demand is about as big for innovation, for technologies. It has become a recurrent thinking. It's difficult to get into a market if you don't have a new product, even if your product is the best in the world. So, if I am to convince my boss to invest into something, I have to convince him that my product is innovative. If I just say it is better, my financial manager will certainly not be enthusiastic. We can add one more point, which was not mentioned and which is scary. It's the sporulated form. If we
ADN de la souche un moyen de la faire sporuler,
have the possibility of having a DNA strain to be sporulated, we could get an alternative. So, of course, there are other problems when it comes to cross-contamination, cleaning, etc. Then we get to tricky issues, but for some bacilla, this is an interesting thing. We didn't speak a lot about GMOs. Plants can act as a capsule for some molecules. Is this not something you work with today?
Are there any other questions? One last question. Make the most of it. We've gone over time. Yeah, and you know, your answers are free today. Yes, a gentleman over here. Yeah, just a comment in relation to the gentleman's question earlier on. I think it's really encapsulation that is the problem in this question. It's the question of the microbial physiology. What types of formulations should be maintained to keep a bacterium viable in a liquid environment? That's the problematic. If it's in a medium that is not dried, it's not in a vitreous state like with a powder or something that's dried at -40. So you need to have a formulation that is in line with the physiology, minimum activity of the organism. Encapsulation may offer a certain solution, but perhaps it's not the main issue. No answers? No, it was just an additional piece of information. Thank you. Let us give our